I don't know if a lot of people have seen pictures of these pools inside of reactors, and they think that if they were to swim inside of the pool, they would die. It's actually not true, even though the pellets are super radioactive. Water works really well at blocking radiation. So you could potentially go into the pool and have nothing happen to you. So as they come out, they go into these pools that, are inside of the reactor, and they just literally sit there for a couple of years, sometimes like 5 years, to literally cool it down because they're still hot. There is no fission happening at that point, but there is some decay heat. So it keeps the temperature pretty hot, so they have to cool it down. And after it goes in the pool for a couple of years, these pellets are carried inside of this giant concrete and metal, almost like barrels. And all the water is drained off. So again, it's solid and it's dry. And then these barrels are carried somewhere. In the case of the United States, they're just carried to parking lots, usually within the nuclear power plant's facility, because we don't have a final repository. We don't have a final place to dispose of nuclear energy waste. And, that's one solution, right? When people say, oh, we don't have a solution for nuclear waste, it's actually not true. Not only do we have a solution, we have several different ones. One of the solutions is to just leave the waste inside of these barrels and let it decay away. But, that requires that we have people monitoring the sites, and that every 100 years or so, we switch the concrete cask because it starts deteriorating. But that's, a solution.
And just to be clear, that's what's happening to most waste in, for instance, the United States nowadays. Yes, it just gets left in these containers.
Yes, because there is no final repository. The United States was supposed to build a final repository, meaning just like dig a pretty deep hole and put the waste in there and let it decay. But, it turned into a mess. It was supposed to be Yucca Mountain, and there was just a lot of protest. The community didn't want to host it. And some experts say the rock formations are not even, suitable for this waste. It is not moving forward, and I don't think it will. So the government is looking into possibly looking at another place. But the thing is that they cannot do anything with the waste until Yucca Mountain or something like it is built. And so for now, the waste is just sitting at the nuclear power plants. And people have some concerns with terrorist attacks and stuff like that. But the truth is, there are videos of these casks being tested. It's actually crazy. They would test the casks having a train hit against it, or like drop it from thousands of meters off the ground and just let it fall. And they're pretty indestructible.
And that's how things are being done nowadays. What's the ideal case? Or what does good nuclear waste management look like?
Yeah, so there are other possibilities. Some of them are being built right now. Some of them are in the works, and some of them are theoretically possible, but we haven't done yet, again, in the US. So in places like France, which, gets 70% of their electricity from nuclear, they reprocess that waste and they reuse it to fuel their power plants. And what they end up with is an incredibly, incredibly small amount of waste that is vitrified, is transformed into like a glass material. And it's put underground again to just let it decay. And whenever the waste is aggressively recycled like that, in about, I think it's like 200 or 300 years, that waste would decay to normal levels of radioactivity. So it wouldn't be damaging to anyone. So that's one thing that we can do in places like the United States, just build this, what are called advanced reactors that can use nuclear waste as fuel. And then the other solution is to just dig a really deep hole and, again, bury it and let it decay. And the hole is pretty small. I think it's something like 18 to 20 centimeters in diameter. And so you just dig very deep, you put the waste in there, and then you close that hole. So you don't have to actually build a facility underground. It's just digging the hole, putting it there, and then sealing it off so nobody has access to it. So yeah, those are the solutions. So this idea that we do not have technical solutions is misguided. We have to just make a decision and build either this, underground facilities, or just the holes, and leave it there, or just use it, just reprocess and use it as fuel again.
I find like thinking about these long-term solutions really interesting. And there seems to be an important distinction between, as you rightfully said, there being technical solutions, and on the other hand, there also being political obstacles. One thing I wanted to touch on is when you mentioned this like Yucca Mountain example, is that this was a project, that I think basically goes back to the 1980s. And since then, has faced various obstacles and challenges, be they right or wrong. But really, it's been like in the political pipeline for almost or over 40 years now, with very little having happened. And it really does make you think, I guess, especially in the US in this case, like getting the will or the political coalitions ready to at least get some solution.
Yes, well, it's really challenging because it's nuclear, right? It's nuclear waste, so it has a lot of baggage. It also, the way it was done in the beginning, the government didn't really get the community's approval and consent. So you can imagine how upset a community would be if the government just informed you that they're building a repository to bury nuclear waste in your backyard. And there's a lot of indigenous issues as well. The location is in native lands. And so there's a lot of environmental justice issues. I would say it's a very, very politically complicated topic. And just for comparison, because I think it's also important, right? Nuclear energy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Nuclear energy produces this waste, but so does every other form of energy. Fossil fuels produce a lot of waste, and we know they kill at least 5 million people every single year just from air pollution. And on top of it, the waste from fossil fuels is causing climate change, which will kill many more people and cause, a lot of human suffering and damages. So nuclear waste is a lot better than fossil fuel waste, objectively speaking. And then when you look at renewables, they don't create waste in the same sense that nuclear does, because it doesn't use fuel. But the solar panels and the wind turbines themselves, and eventually the batteries, they're also waste. And it's waste that we have technical solutions. Of course, we could recycle some components. Wind turbines, the existing wind turbines, are not recyclable, the blades at least. So for now, they're being thrown in landfills. There's concerns around solar panels as well, not being recycled or not being collected and put somewhere. So I think it's important for us to talk about waste for every form of energy production, because they all have their own, issues and challenges. And we should be thinking about them now before we create a bigger problem in the future. I think a good example of that is, plastic waste. It's something that we didn't really think about. We created recycling, but it doesn't actually work. Nobody's really in charge of it. It's not government mandated that we recycle. Nobody's collecting the plastic. And so it just ends up in the ocean or somewhere. So I think we should be thinking about government mandates to also collect and dispose of or recycle renewable energy materials as well, like solar panels and wind turbines.
I don't know if you've had like a chance to look at some of the long time nuclear waste warning messages. It's a bit of like a crazy idea, but it is thinking that if, we're keeping this radioactive waste somewhere for 10,000 years, we have no idea what society or the future will look like there. But we'll presumably want to have some sort of messages that still make it very clear that people shouldn't be touching this stuff. And it's definitely like a Wikipedia rabbit hole, but it's a very fun thing to think of some of the solutions that people have thought about. It's almost like trying to get in touch with aliens or something, or trying to communicate with them.
And unfortunately, it's almost comic, because the wording they chose was very bizarre. It's things like nothing good is celebrated here. Kind of like cryptic, but weird and odd messages that would just make people more curious, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's like the waiter telling you not to touch the plate because it's too hot or something. Like, right, I would 100% just dig straight down.
Right, exactly. You would die. But no, it's saying like we don't do anything positive over here. And it's just like weird and cryptic. I don't understand what the reasoning was, but it's almost like whenever archaeologists found the tombs of pharaohs, they were they were reading these cryptic messages and they were just more curious, right? It feels a little bit the same way.
One small thing I was going to mention, which is like my favorite kind of sci-fi solution out there, is this idea to create like a sort of religion, or I think it's called like atomic priesthood out there. Because when you look at like messages that have managed to stand the test of time, religion is like one of the really good ones. And I think there was some linguist also who wanted to create this kind of religion around atomic energy as a way to kind of either create these myths or like superstitions or something. I just thought it's a very funny idea.
That's so interesting. I had not heard of it. I hope they're just wanting to do a religion against nuclear waste, not nuclear energy itself. But I would be curious to read more about this crazy solution. It sounds right up my alley.
It is mad. And this story of the environmental movement's attitude to nuclear power, I agree, is just kind of very convoluted and quite sad, in that there were some reasonable concerns in the wake of the development of the bomb, and then some kind of increasingly bad science trying to make these very strong connections between the bomb and nuclear power. And then there's just this kind of cultural hangover or something, where there was enough evidence to be quite confident that the power was more or less safe and just overwhelmingly positive for the world. But those attitudes kind of lagged, and it makes me wonder how common that is, just like beyond nuclear, like how many of our like attitudes are just kind of hangovers.
Right. And remember, the people are very, very resistant to new technologies. It takes a couple of generations usually for the technology to be around, for people to see, oh, okay, it's fine. But in the case of nuclear, I think it's really complicated, because the world was introduced to nuclear through nuclear weapons. It started with nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific. And it was, what the United States did there was just awful. They lied to the communities that, they were just going to be away from their homes for a couple of days while they conducted some testing. And they bombarded a ton of islands, like the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. And basically people couldn't go back to their homes. Some of them did and were exposed to high levels of radiation. And then they kind of created something to contain the nuclear weapons waste, which is different than nuclear energy waste because it's liquid, so it's actually harder to contain. And so then we have, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's impossible. It's very, very hard to disentangle that history from nuclear energy, because the science behind it is similar. And even the labs that worked on it, eventually merged into creating nuclear energy.
Yeah, I want to string some words together and maybe this will make some sense. But hearing you talk about attitudes to waste and then just early attitudes to nuclear power in general, there's this kind of pattern or something which looks a bit like what gets called this precautionary principle. And it's something which sounds good on the face of it. It's something like an aversion to new or novel kinds of risks. You hear it a lot in the context of COVID and new vaccines, for instance. And the idea is we have these risks we know, or these dangers we know, and then we have these potential kind of responses to them, but they involve kind of unknowns or unknown risks. And for instance, in the case of waste management, right, we have like you said, we have these new technologies for waste disposal. And then we have the default, which isn't terrible, but it could be improved on. And people don't like the new proposals because they kind of, maybe they feel a bit unknown. But what happens there is you just get stuck with the familiar risk. But that familiar risk is almost always actually worse than the new thing. And it's the same with energy. There's the familiar thing, which is burning fossil fuels. And maybe it doesn't feel so bad because it's so familiar, because it's so well known. And the new thing is better, but less well known. You kind of get this slight distortion or bias, which is kind of unfortunate.
That's exactly that. And on top of that, technology has just gotten more complex. And so when you try to explain to people what the technology does, it just gets lost. It just sounds too complicated. It just sounds scary and unknown. And a lot of people are wary of not having long-term studies conducted. As you said, in the case of COVID, there's a lot of that. And I think that's absolutely a bias. And it's one that I truly don't know how to overcome because of the level of complexity. It's not like putting out more information might be helpful. So it's more about, like I said, unfortunately, waiting for a couple of generations to live with the technology, which is exactly what's happening with nuclear power, by the way. You know, the main people who are still absolutely against it, those are usually older. Those are usually folks who, you know, again, grew up with the fear of nuclear war. These are people who did drills in their classroom to, you know, find a basement in the case a nuclear weapon was launched. So I don't see myself or anybody else convincing them because it's just too entrenched. But the younger generations, like people our age and younger, we don't have that gut reaction to it. And we're looking at this problem of climate change with fresh eyes and in a very pragmatic way. And we're saying, wait a second, why are we shutting down these nuclear power plants again? Like they make a ton of electricity without any emissions, and they're being replaced by gas because we haven't deployed renewables at scale yet. That doesn't make any sense. So what you really see here is a generational divide. And I think it speaks to this precautionary tale, you know, to this bias against new technologies.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about drawing parallels here between nuclear energy and COVID, one thing that really jumps to my mind is the importance of public trust, especially as a way to turn technical feasibilities into political realities. And I guess with COVID, you've got a lot of mistrust in the US population about vaccination schemes, and especially amongst people of color. There were like lots of headlines around this, and this can kind of refer back, right, to things that the US government has done in the past, such as the Tuskegee experiments, where they really undermined the public trust, which is now really hurting them when they do have evidence and a good moral reason to be doing these things now. That was really undermined by mistakes that they made in the past. And similarly, we can think about nuclear energy being kind of the same. And you mentioned the Yucca Mountains before, right? And there's definitely a parallel here where you've got this Native American community that has a very different impression of the US government and lots of reasons to mistrust it, where they wouldn't want the government to suddenly build a long-term nuclear waste facility there. It's a really interesting thing to kind of think about the importance of public trust and really making sure, I guess, that you're getting things right, not just in the case now, but really setting a precedence and building that trust for future cases too.
And it's honestly, it's totally fair. I think that you hit the nail on the head there especially in terms of Yucca Mountain, because Navajo Nation, you know, one of the biggest tribes in the United States, they were severely damaged by the nuclear industry, not the nuclear energy industry as much, but the nuclear weapons industry. So whenever, you know, the demand for uranium increased, they started mining for it in Navajo Nation, which is basically the biggest reserve of uranium in the United States. And at the time, they really didn't know what they were doing. So they were mining without the proper safety systems and ventilation. And people got really sick. People got cancer. And then not only that, they then abandoned a bunch of uranium mines. And one of these mines breached and got into a water system, which then contaminated the water, and a lot of people drank from it. On top of it, a lot of people built their homes with rocks that were highly radioactive. And this is still an unresolved issue. So there are hundreds of abandoned uranium mines in Navajo Nation right now. And, you know, it's still a problem. The government now has announced that it will put some money towards cleaning up the sites. So how do you expect this community to want to host now nuclear waste? You know, of course they won't want to, and they shouldn't. The suffering that they've gone through is horrifying. And I think a lot of people in the nuclear community, in the nuclear energy community, are pushing for the cleanup of these sites because we understand that this is just unacceptable. And then on top of it, there are things like, you know, the Fukushima water release, which if you ask the scientists, you say, okay, what are the risks of dumping this water into the ocean? Scientists can never say there's absolutely zero risk because they're very precise in their language. But they'll tell you the risk is really, really, really small because the water will be processed and all the radioactive stuff will be taken out. The only thing left in it will be tritium. And tritium has never harmed anyone that we know of, like in nature. Tritium occurs everywhere. The sun is dumping it on us all day, every day. And if the government cleans up the water to the level they're promising they will, the amount of tritium in that water will be less than the amount of tritium allowed on like Japanese tap water. Because again, tritium is everywhere. And, if you compare to things like hot springs, hot springs are radioactive. That's why they're hot. The water is hot. Like that water from Fukushima would be around 4 times less radioactive than the water in an average hot spring. But again, I don't think people distrust the scientists. They distrust the government. They say, well, what if the government doesn't clean it up to those levels? What if they leave some things behind? And the Japanese government has made statements in the past that were proven then to be incorrect. They once claimed they had cleaned up the water, but they hadn't. And so these kind of things, they're really not helpful. And it makes people really distrust, all sorts of technology. And even in the case of COVID, in the beginning, you had the CDC telling people to not wear masks, because masks wouldn't prevent the spread of the disease. And it's like, what? Everybody know, like, why do doctors wear masks then? These are things that are just kind of common sense. And when you have big institutions and governments saying these things, it causes a high level of skepticism. And that, to be honest, I don't know how to solve for.
Yeah, this is actually something that I hadn't really considered before, right? But it's very easy to think about all the benefits of nuclear power or whatever other promising technology it is in the abstract, but it's never just the idea of nuclear power. It's never just the technology. It's a technology that's being implemented and rolled out and regulated and governed by a government or just by people. And you can't do that without the trust in the first place. There's this kind of ordering thing.
Right. I think another thing, and this is kind of a prediction, which is I can see a future where a lot of the environmental community will also turn on renewable energy. Because a lot of people have this idea that, the sun and the wind, and we're going to build these power plants and wind turbines, and they're going to be perfect, and we're never going to have to deal with problems from them, and we're going to have, free sunshine forever. They fail to understand that solar panels and wind turbines are very complex technologies that come with their own downsides, right? You need a lot of rare earth materials. You need a lot of lithium for batteries. The amount of mining that will take place in the next coming decades just to provide the supply of materials necessary for, this like so-called clean energy revolution is obscene. And it will come with its own downsides. I don't know what they are. There are issues already in Latin America with lithium and native communities as well. And then if you add, on top of it, the fact that because renewables are energy dilute, they need a lot more land than something like nuclear, you will have a lot of public opposition as well to these massive, solar farms or massive wind farms. And same with transmission lines, because again, with renewables, you need to build a lot more new transmission lines because, you can put solar panels wherever in the country or the state they make sense, but then you need to connect them to the grid somehow. So you need to build all these new transmission lines, which are, again, huge projects, right? So I think that we're kind of underestimating the public backlash against renewable energy as well in the upcoming decades.
Yeah, there's this kind of worldview maybe that you occasionally see where some new promising tech comes along and there's some band of proponents that become convinced it can solve every problem it promises to solve and everything's great. And I can't think of a single case where that's just been unequivocally true, right? So like technology solves loads of problems and almost always brings some of its own problems too. And then some of those problems get solved in the future by newer technology. And just everything is a trade-off. Like everything has pros and cons. And it's just so easy to, get involved with like overhyping something. And then you get, like you mentioned, these kind of pendulum swings of backlash and hype. And it's just a lot harder and a lot less kind of fun and sexy to really pay attention to the details, to the like potential costs of these kind of exciting new techs, and then to say things like, on balance, or all things considered, this thing is going to be very good, rather than this thing solves everything.
Yeah, I kind of think that the better approach is to just say everything sucks. Just some things suck less than other things. Like civilization kind of sucks, but lack of was kind of worse. People died a lot younger and they didn't have access to water readily or food. And, nuclear energy and renewables kind of suck. They all come with their own issues, but they suck less than fossil fuels. So the goal is to just move from things that suck more to things that suck less until eventually we can, hopefully get to a place where everything sucks a lot less. That was not very intellectual.
It was very eloquent. Let's talk about something else which could suck less, certainly than fossil fuels, which is fusion. And we've been talking about fission, of course. Yeah, how are you thinking about fusion? Do you think about it when you talk about nuclear, or really are you just thinking about fission right now?
Will it solve all our problems? Will it be the solution to everything?
Yeah. Is this the one?
Guys, everything else was not the thing, but let me tell you about fusion. This sounds very religious, by the way. It's almost like people keep falling over and over for the silver bullet, right? There's always someone that comes and says, I got you. I have all of the solutions.
And now it's fusion. Yeah.
Now it's fusion. Fusion is the new Jesus.
Get some t-shirts made.
That's the atomic priesthood, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I obviously don't think it would solve all the problems, although it is very, very alluring, right? Because you could have potentially like infinite energy with very little or no waste, and without the risk of a meltdown or something like that, which you have with fission. To be honest, I got interested in nuclear, and my first curiosity was molten salt thorium reactors because Caroline Porco tweeted about it. But then I very quickly got into fusion as well. And people in the nuclear community have this saying that you come for the thorium and you stay for the fission. Because most people, when they first hear of nuclear, they of course come across these videos about, the promise of molten salt thorium reactors and the promise of fusion reactors. And I think they're so compelling because they're technologies that don't exist yet. Because as soon as the technology exists and is deployed at scale, again, you start seeing all the issues and all the problems that come with it. So I am all for technological innovation. I think we should be investing in fusion, and some people are very skeptical that it could ever be achieved, at scale. But, people were skeptical that you could reuse a rocket and people were skeptical that the internet was going to be a thing. So I truly think there is no limit. And we go back to David Deutsch, our babe here, all of our babe, in that our potential to unlock this new technologies is pretty unlimited. So I believe there will be a day, it might be 10 years from now, it might be 50 or 100 years from now, where we will be able to do it at scale. But for the moment, I am more concerned about fission and just trying to reverse public perception. Because also, these biases and these preconceived notions, they will carry on to fusion as well. If they hear the word nuclear, or if they realize it has to do with nuclear, the biases will carry on as well. So I'm more concerned about that.
Zooming out a little bit, can you maybe very briefly explain what exactly fusion is, and maybe as well where we're kind of standing at the moment, what the current state of the art technology is, and what people might be hoping to achieve in the coming decades?
Yeah, so fusion is the opposite of fission. That was not very helpful. But so fission is basically splitting atoms to get the energy that's inside of the atom, which we know has a lot of energy. And fusion is the opposite of that. It's actually smashing atoms together. It smashes hydrogen atoms together to create energy. And it doesn't come with the wastes associated with fission energy, and it doesn't come with the meltdown risk as well. But the complicated thing about fusion, and by the way, fusion is what our sun does. So our sun is a huge fusion reactor in the sky. And that's why Elon Musk, when he's asked about nuclear fusion, he always says we don't need a fusion reactor because we already have one. So in order to be able to get those atoms to smash and like merge together, you actually need an incredibly high temperature, like the temperature that you have in the sun. And you need to smash these atoms at a very high speed as well. So that's why it's been very challenging on Earth to just achieve those speeds and temperature. There are several different companies that are trying to do it using different things like laser beams and plasma and
they are so fun to read about, incidentally.
So fun to read about it. By the way, you guys probably know more about it than I do at this point, because ever since I realized that fusion is super exciting, but kind of farther down the line, I have dedicated all of my time to fission. Fusion has been achieved on Earth, which is something that, some people even doubted could happen. So people have been able to do it, but they haven't been able to sustain it.
Sorry, just to interrupt, but I fell down this rabbit hole as well and was surprised to learn that at this point it's not too difficult if you have the technical chops to build a fusion reactor in your garage with tools you can get online. So that the real challenge, and maybe even the only challenge, is reaching ignition.
Sustaining.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
And also just right now, the amount of energy that you put into fusing the atoms is actually larger than the amount of energy that you get out of it. And precisely because I think you cannot sustain the reaction. But yes, I think there was a kid named Wilson Taylor or something like that who created a fusion reactor in his garage when he was 15. So, I mean, that's, he's a genius. He's not like an average. Me at 15, I was playing with Barbies. He's like making a fusion reactor in his
But
garage.
There are YouTube tutorials now. This is just like common knowledge, it turns out.
Right, exactly. There is a nuclear fusion influencer, and she teaches you how to buy stuff on Target and build your own at home. No, I'm kidding. but maybe there should be. Maybe that's my next step. But it's super exciting stuff, and I'm all for investing in that. I'm also for investing in enhanced geothermal, which is another source of clean and reliable electricity or energy like nuclear, which traditionally geothermal has been kind of geographic dependent. So places like Iceland that have a lot of volcanic action have a lot of geothermal as well, but places that don't have a lot of volcanic activity traditionally have not been able to tap into it. But now there are new technologies being developed that can also dig very deep underground. There's kind of like a parallel between nuclear waste and these types of technology, actually. Dig very extremely deep and tap into the Earth's, heat, into the Earth's core heat, which, by the way, also mostly comes from the decay of radioactive materials. So it's all nuclear energy. I think we don't really get to be picky about what technologies we want to invest in, and we should be, exploring all these different possibilities.
Yeah, it does strike me that there seems to be some meta point of just taking lots of different bets, and especially if, as you mentioned, any technology at scale will have lots of big problems. It makes sense to try and aim for a portfolio anyway, and then it becomes maybe more of a balancing act between things rather than ignoring anything or investing completely into any single technology. Right.
It also depends on your goal. I think a lot of these agreements also come down to people have different goals. Like again, in the case of Elon Musk, his goal is not. I don't think his goal is decarbonization as much as it is to move civilization towards a renewable source of energy. And so that's why I think he doesn't focus that much on nuclear. If your goal is to solve climate change and create electricity without emissions, then nuclear makes a lot of sense. And a lot of people, that are leading the narrative around climate change and environmental issues, they also have the goal of just getting to 100% renewable energy. That's why they rarely include nuclear. I think it's slightly misguided for a couple of reasons. So while the sun and the wind will blow until the sun explodes and everything in our solar system dies, but the materials that make solar panels and wind turbines and batteries are not renewable, right? They're finite. And in the case of nuclear, if we are able, there's uranium in the ocean's water, and there is a way to mine it from the ocean. It's just expensive at the moment. But if we are to recycle all the existing nuclear waste, mine on Earth, and also mine in the ocean, nuclear energy basically becomes renewable at that point, because we would have enough uranium to last for thousands of years.
One last kind of criticism I've heard about nuclear energy is this kind of like link to nuclear weapons. So we mentioned how these are like two different things, kind of inherently, but they are also linked in some ways, right? Nuclear energy doesn't just produce radioactive wastes; it also produces like plutonium, or I guess that is a type of radioactive waste, but it has this special characteristic that it gets used for nuclear weapons. And some concern is that if you spread nuclear energy out, especially to a lot of new countries, these countries can then also be using their nuclear energy programs to produce nuclear weapons. And if you're really concerned about this, then whether you think nuclear energy is good or not on its own merits, you might just be worried that much about proliferation that you kind of conclude against it.
Yeah, so I think it's a valid concern, and I think it has been overblown, because if we look at the history of nuclear power plants, we don't see a correlation in the increase of nuclear weapons proliferation after an increase in nuclear energy consumption, right? So it is a concern, definitely, but it's something that has a lot of safeguards around. So anytime a country wants to start a nuclear power program, they have to go through a long list of regulations, and then they're watched very, very closely, and all the radioactive and fissile material is inspected 1,000 times, and it's measured and weighted. And, fissile material doesn't just move around easily. And what I've even heard is that in some cases, it's better if a country decides to have a nuclear power program, because then you have all these people on the ground that are actually watching it really closely. So if they try to do something shady, like create nuclear weapons, you can actually stop them from doing. And these arguments, came from people who work in the industry and who work in non-proliferation. And the other thing is that most of the risk of bad actors getting their hands in radioactive material comes from the processing plants. So it comes from the beginning, before you get to the uranium pellets. And that is only reserved for certain countries. Like, if you open a power plant in the Middle East, let's say, they wouldn't have a reprocessing facility or an enriching facility. They would only get the fuel already ready to go. And there doesn't seem to be that much of a risk with the fuel and the after, and the waste in itself. It's more about the enrichment.
Yeah. Look, at some point, we need to mention the fact that you are the world's first and only nuclear power influencer. You obviously mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I do want to talk about the story behind this Isodope character. So I don't know what the question is here. Maybe just something like, how did that come about? Like, where did the idea come from?
Yeah, so I came to the United States to be a fashion model, and I worked as that for long. I still do work as it, that's my day job. And the end of 2019, I was very, very down with all the Australia and Amazon fires. And I remember just feeling really compelled to do something with my platform to help somehow solve the issue of climate change. I didn't know what it was, but I just felt this need. And as I started reading into what it would take and what the solutions were, of course, nuclear power came again as one of them. And one day out of the blue, I just decided, what if I become a nuclear energy influencer? And of course, that sounds ridiculous and so silly, but that's the whole point, right? If I just said I was a nuclear energy advocate, people wouldn't pay too much attention. So the whole idea is, okay, I obviously have a platform from this, from the fashion world, and the algorithm seems to favor me for whatever reasons. So why don't I try to hack social media and the algorithm and create a type of content that people want to consume, but that's actually talking about something important, which is in this context, obviously, using nuclear energy to solve climate change. So the whole idea was to, just really create influencer type of content, like makeup tutorials and what I eat in a day videos and like workout videos, and then merge into talking about nuclear power. And it, I think it's been quite successful. It really hooks people who otherwise would never think about nuclear energy or sometimes even climate change. And it at least makes them curious enough to do their own research.
Yeah, well, I just think it's completely amazing. And I think there are probably few people in the world who would think of that idea in the first place and then follow through and make it happen. But some might say it's a weird thing to be doing, and you have friends and presumably, agents and whatever. How do they react when you tell them you're a nuclear power influencer?
Not very well. I think that people were... I think people were very confused in the beginning. There were just a lot of question marks, and even to this day, right? I think my content is very specific and a little weird, like you said. But to be honest, the weirdness of it is what I believe makes it work. If it wasn't weird, people wouldn't pay too much attention. So the whole thing is maximizing eyeballs. So the whole idea behind the character and the whole idea behind the tone of voice and the graphs that I use in the back and everything that I do in my videos is to maximize the amount of eyeballs I'm going to get into my content so we can talk about this very important topic. But, just to answer your question, they're still confused, I think, and some of them think I'm crazy.
Yeah, I'm curious what the feedback's been like from people watching these videos. Do you have an impression you're changing anyone's minds or like getting people interested in this stuff?
I don't think I'll ever convince the super anti-nuclear, 60s hippies who grew up with the fear of nuclear war. But that's fine. That's not who I'm trying to convince anyways. I'm trying to convince my generation and younger, who are the people who are invested in the future of the planet and of the species. So it's been really gratifying to just get people's messages saying, you've opened my eyes and now I'm so much more open. And this is something that is so complex and there's so much misinformation that I don't think it's a quick process. People probably come to my content and they open up their minds a little bit and they do a little bit more research. So I think it's a little bit of a longer process to fully change their minds. But it's definitely being really gratifying. And one of the best things that I get all the time is just people DMing me saying, keep going, what you're doing is amazing. It really helps because some days I look at myself and I say, well, should I really be spending 2 weeks into creating a video that is kind of weird and a little edgy? And is it really having an impact? So receiving all those kinds of messages really, really help me just keep moving forward.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think I asked, have you changed any minds? But maybe that wasn't the right question because maybe, it's more important not to spend all this effort winning over dyed-in-the-wool anti-nuclear types, but instead to reach out to people who don't really know about this stuff or care about it at all yet, right? And, for every one anti-nuclear former hippie, there's presumably 1,000 people, I don't know, my age or younger, who could have some influence on the future with a career working on this stuff and who don't yet know it. And stumbling on your videos could be the catalyst, right? And just in general, it's probably more important to bring people, in off the sidelines rather than just bickering with signed up members of the other team, if that makes sense.
Right. And the truth is all of my content is pretty positive and just highlighting the strengths of nuclear energy and not dismissing other forms of technology. Precisely for that reason, I don't want to be, fighting and trying to convince people who are fundamentally against. I just want to share the facts and let people make their own decisions. And those are usually the undecided or people who just don't have any priors when they come into this conversation.
I was going to say, I guess if people are listening to this podcast now and they feel motivated either to learn more or to actually get involved, are there any places in particular you would direct them to, either on the one hand to kind of learn more about this topic, or on the other hand to actually be involved in this kind of, I guess, like grassroots movement to help promote nuclear energy?
Yeah, so from my side, all I really want is for people to have these conversations. If they feel like they've learned something, talk about it with your family, your friends, and share it on social media. And if they want more content and some sources, they can go to my website, isodope.com. And I share there my favorite podcasts and TED Talks and books and all of that. So it's just easier if they go there and find everything together.
Yeah, I guess one question here is, you talked about the reaction from your peers. What about the reaction from the scientific community? You're like an outsider to these worlds. So what do scientists and nuclear people think about what you're doing?
A mix. Some were very positive and love what I'm doing because they know that I can reach to an audience that maybe they wouldn't be able to, right? And others think that is ridiculous that a model is talking about their field, which I kind of understand. It must be annoying that a complete stranger, an outsider, just steps in and starts talking about something that you've studied for many, many years. So it's a little bit of a mix. Okay,
that's understandable. Now, I guess maybe there are some people listening who are content creators, or they want to start doing something like what you're doing. Maybe not so many people set on becoming the world's second nuclear power influencer, but I'm sure they can talk to you. But maybe a question here is, what is the process behind an Isodope video? Just to get some impression of the crazy amount of work that goes into each video. And also, can you say something specifically about how you do fact checking? I know you've mentioned this idea of talking to scientists with different perspectives and getting them to come up with shared estimates. And yeah, I would love to hear you explain how that works.
Yeah, so I guess a tip for anyone who just wants to start creating content is to just do it. We run into this problem of trying to be too much of a perfectionist, and your video is never going to be perfect and it's never going to be good enough. So you just have to do it and develop a certain rhythm, which I'm kind of saying something I don't do. I try to be more consistent with my content, but it's something that's really hard to achieve. But yeah, just do it if you're thinking about it. And in terms of how long it takes to do my videos, it takes me about 2 weeks to make a 1-minute video, and that's when it's really good. And the reason for that is because from the moment I have the idea, I write it down and then I review it, and then I review it. And I do that about, 10 times before I get to a script that I'm happy with. Then I record it myself with the green screen in the back, and I do some editing and start playing around. And usually I hate everything that's written down, and so I rewrite it. And that process goes on. And then finally I record the final cut, which is, with the face filters and the makeup and everything. And then I do the editing, which takes like anywhere from 3 to 5 days. It's just a lot of editing. It's a lot of pictures, and I like to make sure that it's, that the frames are changing in exactly the right moment. So there is this rhythm to it, and the background is aesthetically pleasing. So it just takes me a very, very long time to create each one of them. And in the fact checking aspect, I do reach out to a bunch of individuals. I mean, there is some information that are out there and very accessible and come from legitimate websites, so I end up using those. But then in some cases, like in the example that you mentioned, is about waste. So I'm doing this whole series on nuclear waste, which is one of the biggest topics, obviously. And I wanted to talk about renewables waste, but there isn't too much data out there on renewables waste. So I initially had worked with a couple of different nuclear engineers to calculate the amount of solar panel waste and wind turbine waste. But of course, nuclear engineers are probably biased towards nuclear. And I'm sure they know a lot about nuclear waste, but they wouldn't necessarily be the experts in renewables waste. So what I did was reach out to a very prominent pro-renewables person on Twitter who he's not, I wouldn't say he's anti-nuclear, but he's highly critical of nuclear and of course promotes renewable energy. So I reached out to him and asked him to take a look over the calculations, and he thought they were done poorly. So we then started working with him and another nuclear engineer to really get the numbers perfectly. And it's been, a very interesting project. It's taking a long time because you have to schedule like different people's times and time zones and all of that. And they disagree, and so they fight over the numbers. But at the end of the day, I think things like this are very important, right? We can't just make false claims, and we can't just accept the data that confirms our priors. We should be looking into counter arguments, and we should be looking to collaborate with people who we don't necessarily agree with on everything. So it's been a very helpful exercise in, following all of that. And I'm excited to just put good information out into the world.
Generating original research, right? That's so amazing. I can definitely say as well, I guess, from like trying to prepare for this episode, like if you just like try and Google like things or about nuclear energy in general, you need to be very careful. I mean, there definitely is like good and accurate information out there, but I guess because it is such an emotive topic, there's definitely like lots of very interesting sites and like very different estimates of kind of the same things as well.
Very different estimates and a lot of craziness on both sides.
Do you feel like you're converging on some kind of agreement through this process?
I think so. I think partly because of the way I'm communicating, which is, and I really mean this, I want renewables to be a part of the energy transition. They're cheap. We should deploy them now. We should be deploying as much renewables as we can right now. And I think that for a long time, the conversation around nuclear and renewables has been so polarized. And so you either belong to one camp or the other. What I'm trying to do is really just say, guys, we need all of it. We're fighting over peanuts.
Yeah, and it feels like there's some lesson here that when you're having conversations like this, and it's so much easier to say than to put into practice, obviously, but probably your motivation should just be to figure out what's true. And you can have priors and they can be strong, but you shouldn't let that shade into something that's just unresponsive to new evidence, right? Like, you're not really allowed to decide that your side just has to win before you hear the other side's arguments. But easier said than done. So what you're doing is very impressive. And there's a kind of segue here, actually, to talk maybe a bit about the environmental movement in general. And it's something you've talked a bit about in the past as well. There's a question about how easy it is and how easy it should be to change your mind on issues like nuclear energy. And there are plenty of issues like it where, taking a certain stance is just bound up with this bundle of beliefs that makes up the environmentalist identity, such that there is a kind of quite right and wrong view to take. And sometimes that can be unhelpful because, it makes it unnecessarily painful to take a different view. So what's the question here? Maybe first of all, I guess, is that true? Or am I just worrying about ghosts? And then if it is true, and this is a stupidly big question, but I mean, how do you begin to change those norms and maybe make it a bit less stressful to change your mind about these big, important questions?
That's probably not just a problem in the environmental community or movement. It's more a human problem, right? We're extremely tribal. And also we have limited amount of time. So whenever we belong to a movement or we belong to a group of people, we take certain assumptions that they make to be the truth, just because it's easier than doing all of the research ourselves. So let's say if a lot of people in the environmental movement are anti-nuclear, whoever joins the movement now will probably be anti-nuclear, not because they don't believe the science. It's because maybe they're so passionate about something else that they don't have the time to investigate nuclear energy. So they're just taking their peers' words for it. And we do it all the time, right? We all of us do it. It's just that we as humans have a limited amount of time to dedicate to learn the things. And so we just, use all these shortcuts. And we know that from cognitive biases, right? We just use all these shortcuts to make assumptions about the world, even though they might be incorrect. But the only thing we can hope to do is really just keep putting the correct information out into the world, and that it will resonate with people, however long it takes.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess it's a fairly endless process. Now, we have 2 more questions, which we ask all our guests. And the first one is kind of related, which is, what significant thing have you recently changed your mind about, and why?
Recently, in terms of more long-term, like older things that I changed my mind on, obviously religion. That was a very big one. And I think actually whenever I changed my mind about religion, it became so much easier to change my mind about everything.
That's interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, because religion is such a big, important thing in people's minds, it kind of defines who you are in a lot of ways, especially if you grow up, with a certain religion in mind. Like, I was Catholic, and so, as a Catholic, we did these certain things. We went to church on these certain days and we prayed. And I think it largely defined who I was for a while. And once I let go of that belief, I think my definition of who I am and my sense of self and identity became much more fluid and much less tied to any specific doctrine or even position. Like, I don't feel tied to any particular position. The only thing it would be very, very hard for me to change my mind on is the belief that, the scientific method is not important. That's the hill I'll die on.
Yeah, no, completely. I feel the same thing. It's like, if you tether your identity so strongly to, believing that P, and then you think, well, if I ever stop believing in P, I just more or less won't be me anymore. So it doesn't even make sense to stop believing in P.
Exactly. And not only is it possible, I think it's preferable as you learn more and as the world changes as well. So can your opinion and your view of the world. I'm sure that 20 years from now, I'm going to look back at all the things that I'm saying now. And I'm going to be like, oh my God.
Well, I really like the idea of tying your identity to ways of coming up with new beliefs and sorting between them, rather than tying your identity to particular beliefs, which could turn out to be wrong.
Right. As a process, as like a way to, to, seek the truth.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Okay. And the second question we ask everyone is, what 3 books would you recommend for anyone interested in finding out more about what we've talked about? So I can talk about the books that changed my life, the most, that have been the most impactful. So the first one was obviously The Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins, as I mentioned before, just because it opened my eyes to science and evolution. It's a beautiful book and it's very well written, so I recommend that. The second one is Our Inner Ape by Franz de Waal, he's a primatologist and he kind of compares the behavior of other great apes to humans. And it's just such an interesting lens through which we can analyze ourselves, because we tend to think that we're so different from other animals in our actions and our psychology. But when you see this, other great apes carrying out activities that look very similar to us, I think it's puts everything into context, and it's just a very interesting way to look at ourselves. And of course, the other one is The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. It's funny because everyone who I have recommended it to writes back saying that that book literally changed their lives and changed their minds. And it's probably the reason why I'm so tied to the scientific method as a way of understanding the world is probably because of that book. It literally freed me from nihilism, and it is very inspiring and motivating. Amen.
I have that book unopened, unread on my bookshelf right now, so it's a good nudge to actually read it.
You have to read it.
Yeah.
Dream guest.
I know, for all of us.
Okay, very last question is, where can people find you online or find Isodope online if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so I think the best place right now is to just go on my website, which is www.isodope.com. isodope.com, and that's ISODOPE.com. And there you have my social media handles and all of that, because my name is kind of complicated and long. And if I tell people now, they're going to be, what?
Okay, I said that was the last question. The real last question is, how do I pronounce your last name?
I know. So my last name is German. I am Brazilian. I don't speak German, so I'm also butchering my last name. I just want to make that clear. But the way Germans pronounce it is Boemeke. I say Boemeke, which is like the Brazilian version of that.
In that case, Isabelle Boemeke, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Isabelle Boemeke on decarbonisation and nuclear power. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Isabelle, and there you'll find links to all the books and articles Isabelle mentioned, along with some further reading. As always, it would be great if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there's a link on the website to an anonymous feedback form, and there's a star rating form on each write-up. And you can send suggestions, questions, hate mail, and whatever else to feedback@hearthisidea.com. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, if you'd like to support the show more directly, you can leave a tip by following the link in the show notes. Thanks very much for listening.